Welcome to section 9.3, where we're going to cover how we control the cell cycle and what happens if we don't properly control the cell cycle. So starting off, if we're going to go through and make sure our cells only divide when they should, we have to have some mechanism in place to let us realize, is it appropriate for them to divide now? Because it's not like we want our cells to divide constantly. If you have an injury, you want to divide cells so that you can fill up the injury and replace that damaged tissue. If you want to grow, or if you're preparing to reproduce, you might want to go through cell division to make sure you can accomplish that. But for day-to-day use, it's not like your cells have to go full throttle trying to reproduce. That would produce too many cells. We just need to maintain what we have, and we need some way of communicating to our cells whether or not it's their time to divide. So to do that, we're going to have these stages or phases where we can control whether or not we move on. So you guys are familiar with the three parts of interphase at this point, G1, S, and G2. Each of those is going to have a checkpoint where we can effectively shut down this process and make it wait. We're also going to have one checkpoint we'll talk about later that's during metaphase. That's the only one that's actually in the middle of the M phase or mitosis itself. And these are all going to revolve around different types of these cyclin molecules. So this is just a small molecule that over the course of the cell's life will tend to build up based on certain signals it receives from cells around it, from your body in general. And eventually, if it reaches a certain level, it can attach itself to this guy called CDK, or cyclin-dependent kinase. This is just an enzyme. And so if there's enough cyclin, it'll attach itself to CDK, and if you have enough of this new complex that we just made, it triggers you to move on to the next stage. Now, I like to think of this like saving up money, where you keep building up more and more money, just like we do with cyclin, and eventually you get enough to buy what you want, and then you spend it all. So you now are back to effectively no money. That's what happens when you look at these stages, as they build up cyclin, and then they attach it to the CDKs, and they move forward to the next part of the cell cycle. But in the process, it uses up all that cyclin they built, so we go back to our default position of having effectively none. This means that we're not going to have to worry about dividing like immediately thereafter, because we have to build up that type of cyclin again, and that can take hours, days, weeks, or years depending on what cell we're talking about. So the end result is then we now have where all of our growth is going to be strongly controlled or limited inside of our bodies. This will be healthy. So with these checkpoints, just to make sure we're clear, we're going to have 4 checkpoints that you're going to see, and we're going to focus specifically on 2 of them more than the rest. So we've got the checkpoint at G1. This is oftentimes called the restriction point, because if at this point you do not give the go-ahead, you can move into G0, which we said is where you're not going to divide ever. So you're essentially going to go through, and we said this is the Peter Pan idea, where that cell is just never going to reproduce, kind of never going to grow up. It's just going to stay that way forever. So it appears some of our muscle and nerve cells will do this process where they go into G0, and I'm not going to say it's impossible to ever move them out of it, but it certainly tends to be unlikely that many of these guys will move out of it at any point in time. They're going to stay as they are for a long time, if not forever. Now, if you do go past this G1 checkpoint, you'll then have a checkpoint in the S phase where we're going to go through, we're going to copy our DNA, but we're not going to move to G2 yet. We'll then pass the S checkpoint and move to G2. Now, this is the other one I say is a big deal, because you can sit at this G2 checkpoint for a long time because you're ready to divide. You know, like you're fully prepped, you're ready to go at a moment's notice, but we don't necessarily need you to divide at that point. And so you could sit there in G2 for a long period of time. We're talking days, weeks, months, because we don't necessarily need you to divide at that point, but we also want to make sure our cells are ready to divide. So if there is something like damage, or if there is something where you're going to try to reproduce, you want to make sure that you're ready to go. You know, it's one of those things that you hurry up and wait. You want to make sure you're ready to go, but that doesn't mean you actually should go. We just need you to sit there ready to go indefinitely. And then metaphase, that one's just where we're trying to make sure everything is lined up properly, like we said, because if we screw up during metaphase, then that means anaphase tugs an inappropriate amount of those chromatids, and then that means that you're going to typically be deformed or dead. And so the metaphase one is really just making sure everybody's good before we move on. So why is uncontrolled cell growth so bad? If you have uncontrolled cell growth, you typically develop tumors. Now, tumors can be a major issue because as these cells keep reproducing, the cells they produce don't tend to do their jobs. And so because of that, they just take up space and they tend to crowd out the healthier cells. And so as they get in the way of those healthier cells, those healthy cells now cannot do their job. It's kind of like if I made you work in a mailroom, and so you had to go through and file the mail, moving all around the room to put it in the appropriate place. And then I start putting a bunch of people that are just loitering, just standing around. And so now there's people in your way as you try to get from one point to the other to do your job. Now imagine if you start to have things back up because you're not able to do your job properly, and at some point if it backs up enough that you get fired, whatever, in this case it'd be death for a cell, things break down. So it's not that the cancer cells are actively killing you. They're not like taking, little cancer knives and stabbing you, but they're preventing our organs, they're preventing our tissues from doing their job. And if we get organ failure or certain tissues, if they fail, you can die. And so this is why it's a big deal. Now, some tumors called benign, this is the friendlier type of tumor, if you will, these ones stay put. And so if they're in a type of tissue that doesn't do an essential job, they're not going to kill you. They can if it's like the brain or somewhere else where they can put enough pressure or crowd out the healthy cells enough. But if you get a tumor that's in like your arm, worst case scenario, you'd have to remove it or amputate, but it's not in a lethal location. Now the problem with the other types of cells, which we would call malignant or cancerous, see if I can spell malignant, these ones are able to go through a process called metastasis. And metastasis is when the cells move. So they essentially break off small chunks of the actual cancer. It then goes through our bloodstream and takes up residence somewhere else. So this is why cancers like prostate cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, skin cancer, these are all in locations that we don't absolutely have to have. And so if they just stayed put, we could theoretically just remove the colon, remove the breast, remove that piece of skin, or remove the prostate, and overall you'd still survive. But the problem is they tend to move into other areas like the pancreas, the kidney, the liver, the brain, the lungs. And when they move into these more vital areas, we can't remove those areas typically, especially not if it's too invaded. We can't just, remove both your lungs. And so at that point, if they get into these other areas, they can cause damage that is fatal. So this is why cancers like melanoma, which is a skin cancer, that kind of funky mole idea, it doesn't seem like a funky mole would be that dangerous. But melanoma is so good at spreading to other parts of the body, like the brain, that's why it's so feared, is because if you don't catch it before it moves somewhere else, it's not that funky mole that kills you. It's the fact that now it's got cancer growing in your brain and your lungs and elsewhere, and they can't operate to remove it, and so now you end up being a terminal patient.